Um, Today, it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Gail Taylor, who is the chair of plant sciences at UC Davis. Professor Taylor recently came from the University of Southampton in the United Kingdom. The UK connection will soon become obvious when you hear her. She received her PhD from the University of Lancaster in the UK, and just 2 years ago came to UC Davis. Professor Taylor is a world-renowned expert in plant science, agriculture, its relation to climate change and to ecological policies more generally. And she's going to be talking about climate change and its implications for food and agriculture here in California. So, Professor Taylor, thank you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to speak to you today. And I hope that I can give you a little flavor about what's happening with climate change, fact versus fiction, and what the consequences are for California. And as you heard, I'm a plant scientist. I've been studying plants for most of my life. I set off to university when I was 18 and started specializing in plant function and genetics, and that's really stood me in good stead for the last 30 years. A couple of years ago, Davis is, of course, the epicenter for plant sciences. The way I describe it sometimes is it's like going for a weekend in Vegas. The Davis campus is complete sensory overload. If you happen to be interested in plants and ag, it's coming at you from all directions. So it's a very exciting place to be. It's really special and unique, and it's something that has to be valued. And so I'm going to talk to you today about how plants, and particularly agriculture, might be impacted, particularly in California over the next 100 years. The big picture and what we should be doing. And, you know, look at those pictures there, just to remind you of this wonderful landscape. California is recognized as a hotspot for diversity of landscape and for also biodiversity. It's this living laboratory, if you like. It stretches a very wide number of different environments, and you can see there the Napa Valley growing grapevines, natural grasslands and mountain vegetation, rangelands subjected to fire there. The Salinas Valley, it's the place where most lettuce is produced in the US, down through Central Valley, producing almonds, for example, and then these iconic world-renowned trees, the sequoias, the coastal and the giant sequoias. So California really has it all in terms of natural landscape. And the way we manage it going forward is critical. So what do we do about climate change? I want to do three things in this talk. I want to give you some of the facts. I want to talk about some particular threats to California, maybe you know some of them, and how we might develop solutions for the future, and where some of those solutions are maybe found to still be wanting. So fact or fiction, climate change, maybe anyone who's interested in the recent news couldn't fail to be aware of this particular group, Extinction Rebellion, with their egg timer logo. I'm old enough to remember CND, and for some reason it reminds me of that, for those of you in the room who remember that. But Extinction Rebellion was formed in May 2018 in London, and they have a mission to rally worldwide support around a common sense of urgency around climate breakdown. And so this is a highly controversial, polarizing group. And so I'd ask everyone in this room to imagine what their views are, to think about what their views are on this group. And again, it's hard to ignore these climate strikes, rallies that are occurring all over the world, and spearheaded by Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old from Sweden, who's taken climate collapse as her mission and wants to bring this to global governance and political forces. So, you know, we have a generation of people who've become much more engaged in the climate crisis, which is their terminology, not mine, and the way they see it. So, as I say, they're calling this a climate emergency, an ecological emergency. And it started in London, but it's gone all over the world, including the US. And Greta Thunberg was in LA just last Friday. And it's interesting to note this slogan down here, which is business as usual, which is, whoops, sorry, is that my fault? No, I've done it. It's okay. I was looking for the pointer, but there you go. Business as usual, which is one of the scenarios that we talk about for future climates, business as usual. And this group are saying that this is death, that we're killing the planet. And there's one of the more outrageous commentators here coming back, Toby Young, who writes for The Spectator, who really thinks that although this group are talking science, their insistence on telling the truth, it could not have been clearer that this global movement is a religious cult with lots of chanting and very focused on one or two individuals. And Greta Thunberg is one of them. And, you know, we're not going to do it today, but take a look at some of those impassioned pleas that she's making to all of us to save the climate and to avoid this crisis. But what about the facts? What we're really interested in here is climate change occurring? And by climate change, I mean anthropogenically induced climate change that's occurred since the onset of the Industrial Revolution and is a consequence of our actions in the environment. Well, if we can imagine the surface of the Earth and a whole bunch of these gases around the surface of the Earth, they do a wonderful job in protecting us from the higher atmosphere, the stratosphere, and they blanket us in these radiatively active molecules, which mean that the Earth has a really rather nice temperature. So water vapor is a very important greenhouse gas that we desperately need. And what we've done is we've added carbon dioxide over the last 200 years or so, and the notion is that we're increasing the temperature because of that. That's actually not a very new idea. If we go back to 1856, John Tyndall first demonstrated that gases could absorb radiant heat, i.e. the very basics of anthropogenic climate change. Fourier confirmed this, and he actually predicted, which is true, that the surface of the Earth would be about minus 18 degrees centigrade without this wonderful blanket of greenhouse gases. So these gases provide us with they make life on the planet possible. But of course, then the next scientist, the Swede Arrhenius, was responsible for showing that he calculated that if you double atmospheric carbon dioxide, there will be some temperature increase. He was predicting 4 to 6 degrees. It's actually 2 to 4 that we're looking at now. And then in the 50s, Charles Keeling, who was the professor of Al Gore, which is where Gore was inspired to become a climate, keenly engaged in climate matters, started actually measuring carbon dioxide in the 1950s in pristine air in Hawaii. And then one of the presidents of the US was very insightful and predicted that by the year 2000, increase in CO2 would be 25%. And that's pretty spot on. So he was clearly listening to his scientific advisors. All of this culminated in the 1980s in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a group of experts who would come together periodically to state the case for science and look at the evidence globally to see what was happening. And in 1992, the Earth Summit committed to a stabilization of greenhouse gases. And so just to go over that legislative process, it's the United Nations Framework Convention that's the international response to climate change. It's a treaty that establishes the basic obligations of 196 states plus the European Union. It was signed in 1992 at that Earth Summit, And there are 197 signatories, including the USA, as of 2015. But of course, we'll come on to it later, but the president has now begun preparations to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. The objective of the treaty is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations, to avoid dangerous anthropogenic change. And the mechanism for this is something called the Conference of the Parties, the COP, the supreme decision-making body. And they meet every year to review progress, and they tend to meet in December. And you may know that they were planning to meet in Chile, and that meeting has been moved now to Spain. So this is the global governance that will enact these policies. But another way of seeing this is that actually that's achieved very, very little. COP21 was the latest, one of the most significant of these meetings, but very little has changed. Carbon dioxide emissions are still 40% higher than 2008, and relative to 1990, they're still increasing. They're increasing at very high rates, and recently, in the last few years, carbon dioxide hit this concentration, 400, which was significant, because we haven't seen that for at least 500,000 years, and probably not for 20 million years. So global temperature has increased. This slide's out of date. It's closer to 1 degree C now. And most nations now want to hold that to less than 2 degrees C, which is what COP21, the Paris Agreement, tries to achieve. So that's where the policy is at. What about the evidence, though? There are 5 bits of evidence that I'll go through relatively quickly about confirming that climate change, anthropogenic climate change, is occurring. We can look at something called ice cores. Those are the air bubbles trapped in ice cores. And you can see the red line there is temperature, going back about 400,000 years. And these bubbles, it's very clear that temperature tracks CO2 in a very nice way. And we can also see that in recent history, we're off the scale in terms of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This is one of those Keeling curves, actual measurements of carbon dioxide, which have been going on since the 1950s. And as I say, 399 parts per million was recorded about 2015. So now we're over 400. That's a waterstone for me, because when I started at university, we were still in the 300s. And so to be going over 400, it's significant. And I can't get the video to run, despite, well, we'll give it a try, but I don't think it will run. But do a search if you're interested, NOA pump handle, because it's an amazing video of all of the sites where that CO2 data has been collected over the last 50 years or so. So there's absolutely no doubt that atmospheric carbon dioxide is increasing by over 30%. As I say, we haven't seen those levels for 500,000 years, and probably longer than that. And the current rate of increase is unprecedented. Global temperatures are increasing. So this is the anomaly record. So the 0 line here tells you what the long-term 20th century, more or less, record would be. And you can see that we're in a cooling period. And then over the last 100 years or so, we've been in a dramatic warming period. And I can show you some data for California in a while. So again, temperature, global surface temperature is rising to around 1 degree. Sea level is rising, maybe predicted out to 50 millimeters in future, and northern hemisphere snow cover is being lost. So we know all of these things. So here's the data for temperature. So at the last decade of the last century was outstanding in terms of beating records. So the 90s were the warmest decade, and 98 was the warmest year. So we continue to break these records. There's a little bit of data here on sea level rise. And if you look at this picture here, there are lots of these images that we see in the popular press, which is ice cap. This was in 1980, and again taken in the noughties, 2003, I think, to see the changes. So the evidence is pretty clear, and we know that there are largely two causes of this, and that's fossil fuel burning. But changes in land use are also dramatic and probably contribute 20 to 30% of the overall greenhouse gas effect. And so it's due to these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So what are these gases? So they're mostly carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide contributes well over 50% of this greenhouse effect. But methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas and contributes around 20%. This doesn't reflect its concentration change, which is significantly less, but it has a very high warming potential. And there are a few other greenhouse gases. So we can think of these radiatively forcing abilities of the gases. So here's carbon dioxide and methane. And then some things in the atmosphere actually counteract the effect of global warming. And aerosols are one of those things. But taken together, we can see that the atmosphere is changing. It has changed over the recent 100 years or so. And we think there's very strong evidence that it's due to those greenhouse gases. What's going to happen over the next 100 years, and particularly what will happen for agriculture in California? Well, if we want to predict forward, we have to start thinking about scenarios. And that body of people that I mentioned, the IPCC, their major task is to develop scenarios for the future and to think about the implications of different storylines, if you like, or different scenarios for greenhouse gas emissions and how we might envision the future to be. And these are often called RCP, or representative concentration pathways. And there are lots of them. There are whole stacks of these scenarios that IPCC works on. But here are a few of the major ones. So there's this blue one here, which is 8, which is a very extreme scenario where we just carry on as usual. We do exactly as we've been doing in the past. We utilize all the fossil fuels on the planet and find out what the consequences of that are. And in contrast, there's this one down here, which is this green one, which is RCP2, where we take dramatic action. And this 0 line here is the 1990. It's like we set the clock at 1990 for the planet. And this is what we call net zero. We can get to net zero. Well, if we took some dramatic actions, we could reduce our emissions. And these are the consequences of these different scenarios on the concentration of carbon dioxide. So I want you to keep those things in mind, because 4 and 8 are usually the two scenarios that are considered. IPCC does incredibly complicated work. So this is what some of those scenarios pan out like, that each major scenario has lots of different pathways that's being considered. But this one down here, this really dramatic emission reduction pathway, will get us to net zero at the second half of this century somewhere, and that we're holding temperature around 2 degrees C. And all of the others are pretty extreme if we look at what might happen to global climate. That's pretty extreme for California, because someone described California to me this week as, oh, it's the USA on fast forward. And we're a little bit like that in terms of climate change. We're really at the edge of this tipping point because of the way our climate is in California at the moment, and because of the way natural resources are. So there are these very dramatic scenarios and different futures that we might want to consider for ourselves. So what might California look like in future? Well, the FITS laboratory has come up with this amazing interactive map recently, which you could go and explore for yourselves. But basically, if we plug in Sacramento into that interactive map, it tells us that by 2080, Sacramento is predicted to have the climate of Bakersfield. And so that's a climate which has significant increased heat in the summer and perhaps less uncertain climate in the winter. So some of these predictions are particularly dramatic for California. So that has consequences in all sorts of ways for urban populations. But the thing I wanted to go on to today was to talk about agriculture in California. Many of you may be aware, maybe some not, but California is a significant state for agriculture, the most significant state. It has twice as many cash receipts as the closest state in producing agricultural commodity. So it's valued at around 50 billion just for the commodity value, and it employs similar numbers, and it has a whole cash value to the state equivalent to some of the IT infrastructure companies, for example. So some of the things that we naturally associate California with, ag employs as many people and is significant. And so this is really important. So many of you probably know that we grow 1/3 of vegetables for the US and 2/3 of fruit and nuts. It's this highly diverse agricultural landscape that's really of critical importance for the GDP of the state. And just to reiterate that, the diversity of crops and agriculture that fits into the climate niches across the state is outstanding. We grow over 400 commodities. If you look at some of the Midwest states that are growing a couple of crops, they're important, but they don't have the diversity of crops that we have. And a lot of those crops are extremely high value crops. So these crops down here, and many on this list, are very, very high value. They're also the fruits, nuts, and vegetables that form part of an increasingly healthy diet. So the concept that we move away from calories and move towards nutrition is very much dependent on continued production of these fruits, vegetables, and nuts. So they're incredibly important to the US diet moving forward and tied into having a healthy nation. So how are these crops going to be impacted in future? What are the consequences for policy? So on the left there, you see another bit of data on how temperature is predicted to increase globally. Maybe it's around 1 degree at the moment, and it's going somewhere above that. We're not quite sure with the scenarios. But if we do some backcasting, that figure on the right is some data that was taken from a review where they pulled out some California climate data. And the red bars there tell us when the state has been warming above the anomaly, the expectation of the temperature. And we can see that we're in a warming period, but not only that, that the warming is significantly more than we're predicting globally from the rest of the IPCC. So that's very worrying, and we're seeing some of the effects of that. What about predicting forward then? Well, again, CalAdapt has run some global climate models. You can make those models run just for California and look at some downscaled areas where we pull in all the climate data. We look at how the models have worked in the past, and then we're able to fast forward to the future. And in this particular report, they just took out 3 sites, so in LA, Sacramento, and Shasta. And you can see that these data are for RCP 4 and 8. But the striking thing here is, irrespective of the scenario or the place, climate's increasing. And so in future, there'll be more warming in California. In particular, there'll be more heat waves in the summer, and there'll be other consequential effects. So what might the future look like? So I've taken this from the 4th climate assessment that was done in California. And what it tells you is how the climate's set to change, and it gives some scientific confidence. How confident are we from the data, from the models, that these things are actually going to happen? So for temperature, for example, there's a very high confidence that this is happening. fits in with the global predictions and the data for models for California. It's the same for sea level and also for snowpack. Snowpack's declining. There's a very high confidence in that, and that's of dramatic impact for California. So, and then less confidence, but still a moderate to high degree of confidence in changes in precipitation. So heavy winter precipitation events are likely to increase. Drought is likely to increase. And we see already that burnt wildfires are likely to increase. So what can we do about that? Well, we can take those climate models, and scientists in the state for 100 years or so have been developing what we call process-based models. So they break apart the plant, if you like, and they quantify every aspect of every process that makes that plant work. So that's what we call a process-based model. And so then we can figure out how the plant is working and yielding in relation to current and future climates. So what we can see here, so Labelle did this in a few years ago now for some of the really important crops within California. And it's very clear that for all of those crops, there's a decline in yield with time as we move forward throughout this century. All of those crops are what we call woody crops. They're perennials. They're not annual crops that are sown in the ground, harvested, and then destroyed. So these are long-term commitments. So for example, an almond crop might be in the ground for 30 years or more. And it's the same with walnuts and some of these other crops. So decisions we're making now about planting are likely to have impacts for the future, for the next 30 or 40 years. And all of the yield of our major crops is set to decline, even in the moderate scenarios. Now we can look a little bit more into some of these scenarios. And again, unfortunately, the IPCC changed their terminology. So we have A and B scenarios here, but they're allied to the 4 and 8. And here we're looking at some crops which are harvested annually. And so there's a little bit more variation. And what tends to happen here is that crops that are adapted to slightly cooler environments do particularly badly in when the temperature goes up. So, for example, cotton doesn't do well at all in either of these scenarios. And then we see in contrast to that, there may be some crops that we grow routinely in California that are not so impacted. This is a very important one, alfalfa, because it's a feed for the most important industry in Californian ag, which is the dairy industry. So we can see that maybe for annual crops there's slightly more variation, but overall the picture is pretty bleak in that yield is being negatively impacted by climates of the future. So the elephant in the room, if you like, is this one. And this is one that's not, this is a really difficult issue. This is a bud of a tree, and you know that trees enter a period of dormancy over winter where they set buds. So the leaves fall off all of our major fruit and nut crops, buds are set, the tree enters deep dormancy, and then in the spring, temperature increases and dormancy is broken. Now, many scientists have worked out that's an extremely tightly programmed set of genetic events. So these tree crops have probably taken 10,000 years to become adapted to that seasonality. So chilling down, entering dormancy, and then coming out of dormancy. And if we look at that in terms of crops, we often refer to that as safe winter chill. So these fruits and nuts, they need to have this chill in order that they can break dormancy, come out of dormancy correctly, in this programmed set of events, make flowers, which then become pollinated, that turn into the fruits and the nuts. And here we've got a strip of the Central Valley where much of this activity occurs, and this strip is lying this way here. And so you can see that during the 1950s, we're in a very safe zone because there was about 1,000 hours up and down the valley of winter chill. And you can see during the 2000s that decreased, and then during 2041, this is for one of the scenarios for IPCC, you can see this extreme reduction in the chill hours that are required for all of our fruits and nuts. So is this really important? Well, what we know is that all of these crops are vulnerable. So these are the crops that need quite a lot of chill hours. We have some of these woody crops that need rather less. And in particular, walnuts require the highest number of chill hours because walnuts have been taken largely from Mediterranean environments and grown in California. And so that's extremely worrying because the walnuts we're planting now will be subjected, and we're already seeing that. So, you know, if I had some smart money, I'd probably be predicting that some of those industries will be traveling north as the chill hours reduce in California. However, that's not my bag. My bag is being a plant scientist. So our mission is to find the plants that can tolerate the environment of California in the future. But just to put some numbers on this, the global market of walnut production is around $6 billion at the moment. About a quarter of that, or a third, is US grown walnuts, and they all come from California. So global exports are dominated by actually my department. So we went out and found all of these rootstocks. So maybe you're aware that all of the trees you see up and down the valley are grafted. So these rootstocks all have particular names, and they were selected 50, 60, 70 years ago. They're cut, and then a grafted stem is placed on top for nut bearing. So these rootstocks have now been adopted all over the world. They're grown in all of the major walnut growing areas, although California still dominates. So California, as I say, it's part of the healthy diet. Global production is predicted to go to about 8 billion by 2025. The world can't get enough walnuts. They're being eaten more. And the world is dominated by these UCD releases. That's fantastic. But the problem is now we have germplasm, this plant material, which isn't going to be suitable necessarily for the future, and it's already in the ground. So scientists at UC Davis and elsewhere have been working on those sorts of vulnerabilities and came up with a report a few years ago which put all of these things together and came up with this Total Agricultural Vulnerability Index for California. And and that includes lots of different things that I won't go into detail, but climate and also some socioeconomic factors. But what we can see from that map is that there are some extreme areas of the state which will be impacted going forward. So the Central Valley is a hotspot. It relies on many of these crops, these perennial fruit and nut tree crops for its economic value. And then a second area here, the Salinas Valley, where all of the salad crops are grown. They're exported all over to the US, to Canada. They go to different areas of the world. That's significant. So this is worrying. The state is vulnerable. This was published a couple of weeks ago. If California agriculture fails, that has an impact on the whole of the US. This is the transport, this is food transport for the whole of the US, which has been mapped by Megan and co-workers here. And you can see these deep blue lines show that California is this place where food is produced and it's largely going out to feed the rest of the state. So this is significant. What about solutions? So California is world leading in attempting to find these solutions and has its own climate change assessment. So this is a summary of the pyramid of events that it's a sort of mini IPCC for California. So look at the research, get specialist group, make synthesis, reports, and try to deliver solutions for the state. And a number of threats have been identified during that process. We've heard about wildfires. What's the solution? Well, we have to have more prescribed burning. We have to do more forest thinning. Groundwater. We've heard about droughts. We need better forecasting to know about water. We need better water storage to give us resilience. Forests are important for biodiversity. Also, we need to do that prescribed burning. Rangelands. Rangelands have lots of non-native grass species and oak scrub. We need to improve the soils, increase organic matter to reduce fire risk and also retain more moisture. We need to be measuring hotspots and managing the landscape accordingly. And we've heard about agriculture. We need to start looking at irrigation and how we manage it. So just then going back to solutions for California. So Paris 2015, of course, was where COP21, where the world signed a new agreement to really try to limit temperature rise to close to 1.5. They've now drifted a little bit to say, well, maybe it will drift up to 2 degrees C, but it's to hold climate change as close as we can to a modest rise in temperature. And of course, it came to fruition in Paris at COP21, where there was a huge celebration that the world committed to that, to hold dangerous climate change at this level. And of course, President Obama signed that commitment at COP21, but now the US is moving to move out of that commitment. And President Trump initiated that in 2017, and just a couple of days ago initiated the withdrawal. But California, in contrast, is leading in world climate change policy. But the question I would ask all of you, is it leading in action? Policy making's the relatively straightforward bit. Making those policies work is what we need to do. But 2018, Governor Brown committed to that net neutrality, so getting to net zero by 2045. It's interesting for me because the UK and California are often world leading in these policy initiatives, and the UK just committed to net zero by 2050. This goes hand in hand with the original, the very first global cap and trade, where producers of greenhouse gases are meant to pay for greenhouse gases in California. But has that stopped emissions? Electricity will be carbon neutral by 2045, and we can say that California can be the blueprint for the rest of the world. But look here, 41% of emissions in California, this is the emissions map, are from transport. And then 20% from industry. We're not tackling these significantly. It's unlikely that we will be successful. Agriculture's around 8%, and so we're doing some things to improve agriculture. So then just to conclude, I hope I've shown you that climate change is here to stay at the moment in California. That agriculture is one of our most important economic activities, and it will largely be impacted in a negative way. And we're world leading in California on policy development in this area. What I'd like to see is action following those policies, and significant unresolved issues are there for California, water and these chill effects. And so my job as a plant scientist is to make sure the germplasm is there for the next 100 years of success. So thank you very much.